Now I will post my tweet with supports L as a hashtag.
Yes, indeed. I think we have heard just such a rich amount of just fantastic information. So we do have some questions from the audience, but before we go to those, I'd like to just follow up with some other questions. So one of my questions for Esther in terms of teacher preparation, since most of our English language learners, as also Joe mentioned, are not in front of a specialist for most of their day, and are not in bilingual ed programs or even, rigorous ESL programs. Given that, what do you think are some ideal pre-service requirements for all teacher ed candidates? Because the reality is that pretty much all the students going through teacher preparation programs now will at some point have at least one English language learner in their teaching career. And I think the University of Florida has been trailblazing in terms of addressing this. So I'd like you to speak to that. But what should all teacher ed candidates know before they step into a classroom?
How long do we have?
The thrifty and pithy version.
This is an interesting piece for me, because being part of TESOL International Association, where our focus has been on building the expertise of English language teachers, to think about what that expertise is and how do we translate that to mainstream teachers has been something that's been very much on the forefront of our minds as we're re-engaging and developing standards for teacher preparation programs. Let me talk to you a little bit about Florida. So University of Florida is not unique in doing what we're doing, but Florida is quite unique in the framework that they have in terms of requirements for pre-service teachers. So let's see if we can recap this real quick. So Florida has, since 1990, a Florida consent decree in recognition that ELLs were not being served, and rather than going to court, we had an agreement. And one of the stipulations in the agreement was that particularly elementary teachers, but also secondary teachers, needed to complete a certain amount of professional development once they started working with English language learners. This was for in-service or practicing teachers. For elementary teachers, and let's focus on that group for a moment, that is 300 hours of professional development. 300 hours. And when you got your ELL in your classroom, the clock started ticking, that you had to provide, basically complete 5 courses that was worth 300 hours. In 2001, the responsibility to preparing teachers was moved up to the Institutes of Higher Education and said, listen, the districts can't just do this all by themselves. Pre-service candidates should be prepared to work with ELLs. That should be part of your teacher preparation. And so those 300 hours moved into teacher preparation. As you can imagine, if you have already an existing elementary teacher preparation program, there's not exactly room for 5 courses, right? So what the Florida Department of Education said, well, that's at least you should have at least 2 courses that are focusing exclusively on ELLs taught by ELL faculty or ESOL faculty, and then the remainder of the competencies that are part of ELL teacher preparation can be and should be infused in the remainder of the program. So that's the model that Florida has, and we're probably at this point still one of 4 states that have that strong of a requirement to prepare elementary teachers. So then the next question is, well, what is it that these teachers need to know? And do they need to know something that's a little bit different than what specialist ESL teachers know? Because one of the things that we're finding in our research and in our practices is that mainstream teachers can become language teachers up till this point. But they often need to collaborate and connect with an ESL teacher to really target those very specific language kinds of skills in order to effectively integrate language and content. So what does it mean? Mainstream teachers need to understand what it means to be linguistically and culturally responsive teachers. That's probably the big picture. And that means they need to understand second language acquisition. They need to understand how culture works in schools. They need to understand what kind of pedagogy makes sense for second language learners. The second piece I wanted to add to that, though, is that they also need to know how to collaborate with the people around them, how to find the resources, because they cannot do that all by themselves. So that's an important piece, just kind of in a nutshell, in terms of what Florida does. Creating frameworks that on the one hand say, we expect all EL teachers to be prepared to work with second language learners. That should be a given no matter what the state here. What that exactly looks like will probably vary again by state. But I think to try and find a model where one teacher can do and meet the needs of all students, this is, some people refer to this as distributed expertise. What's really necessary, and we talked about this earlier, is that the expertise around ELLs needs to be distributed across the system. Sometimes it's in an ESL teacher, sometimes it's with the mainstream teacher, sometimes it's the literacy coach, sometimes, hopefully always, it's the principal. But it needs to move up the system to the district level with curriculum directors who need to make choices about the curriculum. And do they understand ELL issues well enough to make responsible decisions, and or do they know where to go to get that information? So it all helps to build in the end that when we make policy or engage in practices, that we think of ELLs as integrally part of our policy making from the get-go. What happens too much still, and I think both of your stories show that we can't keep doing it, is that we establish policies for one group, and then we say, oh, we have ELLs too. And they become an add-on. And what we need, and this is, I think, one of the other things that you're hearing, is we need to set policies that think of all students from the very, very beginning. Thanks.
That was wonderful. So, Joe, in that same vein of having a vision of what everyone should be doing. So overnight, we have to be realists and pragmatists, and we know that every school is not going to transform into an internationals, model. But which of your 5 very, key principles that drive, the strategy, the essence of internationals, which one or two, or maybe some other that you did not mention, do you think could be replicable across the country? That policymakers, that district leaders, that, teachers could, just immediately start addressing?
Maybe I'd point to the work we've been doing through our I3 grant. And the way that we approached that was, I've described it as trying to be more intentional about what I've seen often happening in schools by accident. I've been in lots of schools where someone has introduced me to a social studies or a math or a science teacher, and they say, oh, we put all the ALL kids in his science class because he's really good with those kids. And it's because that person's motivated. There's something about them that, odds are they haven't gotten any intentional training along the way, but they keep putting the kids in that room. And so one of the ways that we approach this work, where we've gone into some schools outside our network, is simply trying to be more intentional about it and say, let's gather those people together. Let's give them time to collaborate. So I would say the collaboration, as has been mentioned, is a real critical part of that. You really need to build up an anchor group of people who have deeper expertise at the school level, who are the culture carriers and the owners of the expertise inside the school. We can be really great at what we do. I think there's a lot of things that we do really well, but we're not in a school every day. The people in the school need to own that work if it's really going to penetrate and live in the school and impact the students on a daily basis. So I think organizing, identifying those teachers and actually giving them real support and real training so that they can then share that and develop that support in other people is critical. And just the other thing I'd say is, as a principal, I used to say, if you gave me the option of you'd give me more money or you'd give me more time, I didn't like to say it publicly, but I'd take more time. there are so many things getting thrown at schools, right? Part of my job as a principal was to try to juggle all those things and create some coherence out of what was a very incoherent environment. You're being asked to do so many different things, and I think I'm a parent of a child with special needs, and I see this in the special needs world as well, that it's seen as a burden, it's seen as a compliance problem that needs to be solved, right? So we're going to give you this training for special needs kids, or we're going to give you training for ELL kids, or training for literacy kids, and it's very segmented and it's very scattered and it's not coherent at all. And so the message that often is perceived by teachers is, oh, here's another program that I have to learn how to implement. And so one of the challenges to being a school leader is trying to make some coherence for the staff in that, and help them understand how does that all fit together on a real practical level and instructionally and in terms of the school structures, but also just from a deeper perspective as a leader of really sending the message that all of these students are important, regardless of who they are and where they came from, and we need to do the best we can because we want all of our students to be successful, not just some of them.
Absolutely. And Steve, actually, you answered the question I had for you, which was, what do you feel is missing, from the current dialogue, debate, narrative on immigration. So you addressed, everything that's missing. So in terms of illustrating what that looks like, so that people can have, a concrete idea of where have you seen this happen, and how well. So how has a community or a group, how have they taken on the task of, for lack of a better phrase, changing hearts and minds?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think has been interesting that I've seen across the country has been the growth of what's been called the welcoming communities movement, and basically, and this is actually they're working with the White House now. But basically, the idea is how do we go, and I think focusing on communities that are not traditional immigrant hotbeds, but how do we go to these communities, a lot of times that are economically struggling, and get them to really engage with immigrants and have them fully understand how valuable immigrants can be. You go to a place like Dayton, Ohio, for example. Nobody thinks of Dayton. I mean, you don't think that immigrants are, coming off the boat or the plane and saying, I'm going to go to Dayton, Ohio. And you know what? And to its credit, Dayton, Ohio has said, well, what can we do to actually get them to start thinking that way? Because they recognize that immigrants bring a lot of value. And if you're able to do a couple things, think about translation of basic services into certain languages, set up person-to-person links between native-born folks and immigrant communities. What are some symbolic steps that city government and municipal governments and some of the local leaders there can take that really send a signal to immigrant communities that say, hey, we're open for business? I think that's one example. So, we at the New York Immigration Coalition, so a lot of our focus is thinking about upstate cities, Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, the North Country, Utica. And how do we say, what's the coherent argument that we can make to those cities that say, look, a lot of the manufacturing jobs that were built in the 60s and 70s, 80s, they're not coming back. And so there really needs to be a fundamental rethink about what's the economic model, what are going to be the drivers of good jobs and a strong economy moving forward. And hey, immigrants should be a part of that. I think the shift is starting to be made. I think people are starting to understand the argument because in a lot of those cities, there's been tremendous population loss. When you go to some of these downtowns, they're totally hollowed out. And a lot of times the people who are coming in to fill those spaces, those shuttered storefronts or the housing that's being, lost are immigrants. And so there's starting to be more of an understanding, I think, of some of those areas that immigrants can and should be part of the answer economically, culturally, and socially.
And that's funny you should mention Dayton because it was, their business community coming together, with the school district and, and other leaders and really, creating, there's, we tend to really underestimate the power of that friendly hello, that handshake, the visual of the, open arms. So simple to do. So that leads into this first audience question, saying, we have a Republican candidate for president.
Who is that?
For those people who are Harry Potter fans, maybe we should start calling him Voldemort. No. We have for president whose behavior is the bullying that teachers have always worked to discourage in their students. When some students imitate this candidate, chanting things like "build the wall" to Latino students or telling Muslim students they will be expelled, and this is for all of you, how should teachers respond? What are some of the best approaches you can think of?
I wish I had a better answer for this. I would start by saying, please don't ignore that. I think, anytime a controversial issue comes up in the classroom, there are some teachers who embrace it very willingly and others who run away from it because I think they're uncomfortable trying to address it. But as I was saying before, students are talking about this and it's causing them a tremendous amount of distress. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that by having a space where that conversation can happen and understand that it's going to come with some discomfort for everybody, including the adults. I think, in a school community where you have a culture where those kinds of things can be addressed, it's a lot easier to have that conversation. If it's a school community where those things are constantly submerged and, issues of race and class just are not discussed in that school community, it's going to make it really hard to talk about something like this. So it's hard to answer it without getting at the broader issue here about what kind of school community you're creating and whether or not everybody feels welcome and students have a voice in that community. But, it's also, as Steve emphasized so much, this is about thinking about the broader community that your students and your families are part of. This is not something that the school needs to do alone. And it's a real great opportunity for schools to reach outside the school door and into the community and to work with immigrant serving organizations that do have a lot of expertise that I think would be of great benefit to partner with schools.
Steve or Esther?
I echo that first and foremost. I think ignoring it is condoning it. It also reminds me of something that you were saying earlier about people not knowing what their rights and responsibilities are. And so a piece of this is education. In order to be able to have some of those conversations, part of it is having the knowledge to be able to negotiate some of the comments that are being made. So if comments are being made, well, they're here, they shouldn't be here, they don't belong in school, that at least there's some wherewithal as to what do the laws actually say about that and what rights do children have in schools, and as well as parents, because I think there's a lot of pieces around parents as well.
I had one more thing about that. I was going to show you this photograph and I decided not to. But I was in a school recently and there, I would say in general, the culture in the school, there's not a lot of vandalism or graffiti. The school is generally, I think, it's a very positive school community where there's not a lot of issues with that. And outside the 12th grade U.S. history teacher's classroom was a sort of 6-foot wide bulletin board that had information about the election and all the presidential candidates. So this was back a little earlier in the primary process. And a lot of people have probably been at schools where they have everything covered over with plexiglass or bulletproof glass so that nobody can take anything off the bulletin board. This school kind of has everything out there all the time because nobody generally messes with it. And so there was information on all of the candidates on the bulletin board, and students had done all this work. And for weeks, everything went untouched on that bulletin board with one glaring exception. The first time it happened, it got replaced, and then it happened again immediately. I had a couple pictures of this, and one of them was, and again, this is not something that happens very regular in the school, but someone sent me a picture from the school, and there was the picture, which I won't identify, was sort of wound up in the toilet in the bathroom, in the student bathroom. Repeatedly and sort of left there, and it became kind of a thing, right? And it was a somewhat quiet, subtle protest that was happening, but this was happening over and over again. And to their credit, the teacher sort of was somewhat frustrated by this because it kept happening, but also did use it as an opportunity to have the conversation about why that was happening. And I think it led to a really productive conversation with the students.
Yeah, I don't. I'll leave it to my colleagues on the panel who are much more familiar with school contexts. Coming from more of a political background, I think my instincts would probably not be as appropriate in a school context. I would just simply say, though, that leadership matters. And time again, when I see in New York State where political leaders step forward and what they say or what they don't say makes a big difference. Rhetoric makes a difference. In Long Island, there was this real wave of anti-immigrant hatred that came out in the early 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s, led by a Democratic chief executive of Suffolk County, Steve Levy, who just started to say these really terrible, awful things about, anchor babies and just very, very hateful things. And there was a rise in school violence as well. And what ended up happening was a couple white high school kids, who later testified that it almost became like a hobby for them to go around and beat up brown-looking people. They found an Ecuadorian man, Marcel Lucero, in Patchogue, Long Island, and they killed him. And so what's, I think, the good thing that's happened after that is there's been a real sea change where, I think the county executives that have come out after that, they've passed language access executive orders. They've really made more of an effort to be immigrant friendly. And the tenor of the rhetoric has definitely died down. The crazy Minutemen, people like that have, went into the woodwork. Now they're coming out again a little bit because of Donald Trump and the folks who are out there agreeing with him. So, how much of that is translatable into a school context? I don't know, but I do see that in the political arena that leaders and words matter, and we need to be vigilant about that. And if they're not going to say the right things, we need to make them say the right things.
Absolutely. Here's a question regarding language maintenance. I have many Spanish-speaking friends, and some of them are having difficulty in terms of their children maintaining their home language. The moment they start attending school, their English takes over, and all or most of their Spanish is forgotten. Has this been documented or studied systematically, since this is a real concern to many bilingual families?
Yes, it has been studied. We've been following generations of children, looking at their language use and the pattern, even in communities where there's a lot of influx of new immigrants. It's within 3 generations, the language loss is pretty real. It's a very small percentage. I think it's maybe 19% that would still speak the language other than English at home. The United States is known by some as the graveyard for languages, despite all of the linguistic diversity that we have. So it's very real, and it's a very consistent pattern for us in terms of immigration.
Yes, that reminds me of a popular joke in the ELL community as to, what do you call a person who speaks, 3 or more languages, a polyglot, a person who speaks 2 languages, bilingual. What do you call a person who speaks 1 language? American. And, unfortunately, we just, haven't embraced it, which leads into this next question, is what more can be done to, to alert the public about, the benefits of multilingualism? Steve, mentioned, just, the value of having, immigrant communities in our cities and towns. So what more can we do?
So one thing I would say is I think that more connections between the folks who are actually doing this really valuable research, like Professor DeJong, and some of the advocates out there would be useful. If I had a dossier of, and I could go to Utica School District or go to some of these other school districts and say, look, immigrant students bring this kind of benefit, right? And they will bring this kind of economic benefit down the line, and these students will have this kind of income boost, and, that would actually be really powerful. And I think, so the more connections that can be made, I think, between academia and policy on one hand, and practitioners, advocates, and organizers on the other hand, I think is really important.
I mean, I was in graduate school 20 years ago, and there was a lot of research then that showed this. And so I think, more of it is good, and more of it is certainly important. And I think, like Steve said, making people more aware of that research. But we obviously have a huge political and cultural problem here as well that we've referenced a couple of times, and that's probably the biggest obstacle. You will find increasingly, this is true in New York City with some of the dual language programs that have opened up, which are really great things for the system. There's a certain cachet that comes with those now, right? Because you have wealthier parents who want their children to learn another language. Mm-hmm. That's great. But I think we need to leverage that to make sure they're not the only ones that are benefiting from those opportunities.
So I think actually getting some of those data out around really good dual language programs, that actually we have many programs that are not just for those native English speakers, but in fact combine and integrate speakers of other languages, let's say Spanish speakers, with native English speakers together in a classroom, and the program is set up to develop high levels of bilingualism and biliteracy for all of the students. So you're actually leveraging each group's resources for one another, and it's an extraordinarily powerful model with extraordinarily positive results. So that part of that is getting that message out despite the politics. One of the other efforts that we see is things like Seal of Biliteracy. So it's a very visible efforts at different state levels, and in fact at different local levels, where when students demonstrate certain competencies in more than one language, their transcript from high school gets a seal of biliteracy. This now will translate into employers being able to say, I'm going to look at you because I know that you have this evidence of really knowing two languages. And so I think that's another way of making visible the value of knowing more than one language.
Okay, we've got a question regarding rural schools and rural settings. And considering that the number of students is growing in these remote places, what are some strategies that have been successful and unique, within a rural context?
So I think rural schools, face a very unique challenge because a lot of times they're working with smaller student populations and I think don't have the kinds of access to large resources that I think larger, like New York City has Language Line. They have access to this telephonic interpreter bank of like hundreds of different languages. You're not really going to have that in and of itself, obviously, in a rural school. I would say that I think there is benefits in thinking about the larger network of other potential schools and allies and partners that you can connect up with. And it may have to involve technology. Like you may not be able to get a Karen language speaker or a Nepali speaking, interpreter to have parent-teacher conferences, at a bunch of different rural districts. That may not be possible. And so, I think that utilizing technology may have to be part of the answer, even though it's not ideal. But I do think that being able to leverage larger networks that do have the resources that you have. So if you're, for example, a Utica school district and all of a sudden you get a bunch of Bosnian refugee kids, what are other schools, what are other institutions that you can then tap into to be able to say, well, we need folks to work with these kids on a number of different levels. And, because in and of itself, a rural school district very rarely will have the resources to really deal with some of these the issues and provide the kinds of supports that both the L students and their families need.
And just to pick up on that little shameless plug here, perhaps, but we just worked on a proposal for another I3 grant. The organizing principle behind it is actually work with smaller and rural districts, because what we've been finding over the last 2 or 3 years is nationally, those are the districts that have been contacting us much more frequently because of the conditions that you described. And so part of what we've kind of framed in that proposal was thinking about how can we both collaborate with them and help share some of our expertise, but help develop local expertise, but also to think about how to network them together so they can continue to learn from each other. Because it's great, they can come. We get people come and visit schools in New York City or in the Bay Area all the time, and it's great. They enjoy it. They feel very inspired by what they see. But that's not the reality of the kind of place that they work in. So they can take something away from it. And so I think it's a real challenge. I don't think there's a clear answer to it, but I do think there's a huge opportunity out there right now to do something about that. We'll find out in a few months whether or not right now we have an opportunity to do that. But
I think that's the challenge is tremendous. I think the networking part is huge. Obviously, teachers need professional development. And I think there are a lot of online accessible professional development opportunities. I can't do a shameless plug either, probably, right? But the networking and basically locally driven professional development so that you build that expertise within is very important.
And I'll actually chime in on that one since I actually just learned of a district in Southern Oregon that has been recruiting members from the community, parents or other family members to go through the paraprofessional credentialing system and getting them just prepared for interpretation, to work in classrooms, because they're not going to get ESL or bilingual teachers, but if they draw from the community, then then they can spread the wealth. And for our last audience question, how do we address the multiple goals for ELLs? We have balanced bilingualism, biliteracy, versus preservation of the home language, transmission versus exit, from ELL status. So do we let instructional models drive policy, even if things along policy like in ESSA get left behind, or just what do we do in terms of limited resources? So, a little bit of a complex question, but how do we balance just all the requirements and the needs and everything that we need to address? Oh, so this is a stump the panel question.
Well, this is where I tend to come from with these kinds of things. There's never, as I said earlier, there's never one model that will meet all the needs. And the idea of a dual language program, the fact that you can, for example, bring together native English speakers and native Spanish speakers and have a two-way immersion program, cannot be implemented everywhere. So one goal can be, let's implement it where we can, when the conditions are right. But that doesn't mean that we don't operate on certain principles when it comes to all of these other contexts, because we know there's certain things that work better than other things. It's not always a model. I kind of liked what Joe was saying earlier. There's some principles that we know are really important to implement. And so when we think about policy, those principles almost have to come first. So the fact that, for example, experiential learning and language and content integration and authentic opportunities to use language are huge for the development of other languages. I would hope that if we put schools together and we emphasize the learning of English and emphasize learning of other languages towards bilingualism, that will also support language maintenance at home. That we bring in the community, we bring in the home to kind of say, you know what, we're not at this task of bilingualism all by ourselves. It just saddens me that I still talk to parents who say the teacher that's working with me tells me I cannot speak my own language at home. That is a message that is, well, you can fill in the blank, right? So I think the idea that we have these principles, and for me the principle, in addition to the kind of pedagogical pieces, is that whatever we do, policy-wise, school-wise, approach-wise, it has to affirm the students that we have. We need to affirm them for the cultural background that they bring. We have to affirm them for the linguistic background that they bring. And we need to do that in a way that is equitable and inclusive within a school environment and within a district environment. So to me, in the end, the balance is how do you allow for policies that allow for that flexibility, for context differences, yet insist on these parameters and say these are the non-negotiables. Not an easy solution.
Yeah, there's a great quote by Thomas Sobel, the former state commissioner in New York, and he's something to the effect of that you can regulate the worst abuses out of the system, but you can't regulate excellence. And I think, I think about the educational opportunities that my kids have had, and when you talk about more privileged kids and talk about wealthier kids, there's lots of options, right? There's different programs that they can sign up for. So somehow, when it's in that context, we don't seem to have a problem thinking that there's multiple ways to get there. I think the emphasis on there are different ways to do it, and there should be some principles. And I think the research bears out that there are some things that we know do work. I believe in what we do, or I wouldn't do it, but I don't think we're the only model. I think there are other models and other programs out there that serve this population that are really powerful models. So I don't think that we don't know what they are. I think in some cases that's true. I think in some places there is a real lack of awareness about what those models are and even what those principles really are. But I think there is so much emphasis on minimal compliance that we get stuck there, and it's very, again, I'm not a policy person, but as someone who was a practitioner and was on the receiving end of some of the policy, I would say, it's clearly designed for the worst case scenario, and it's designed to ensure a very minimal level of quality. In many cases, that's letting people off the hook a little too easily. And it's, the answer to that's very complex. So, we've mentioned leadership, we've mentioned resources, we've mentioned community buy-in. I think if it were that easy and only one of those things is what you needed to be more successful at this, then I think we probably would have solved it by now. But I do think it's pretty complicated. But there is a real lack of awareness, and I think that's we've got three different kind of constituencies represented in here, and that we've got a research perspective and community organizing perspective. And I approach this as a practitioner. This is a great opportunity for us all to talk to each other. That probably doesn't happen often enough, I would say.
You'll take a pass on that one. So we have come to the end, but I would like to get your closing thought on this issue, and for practicality purposes, is there any particular website, book, group that you would like our audience here and the audience who will be watching the video later on to go to for more information?
I've been volunteered to go first.
And your closing thoughts, of course.
Yeah, just my closing thoughts are simple. I don't think we're going to resolve the issue of working with and with L students and providing them the support they need by looking at it as an L student issue. This is something that's on all of us. We need to change the tenor. We need to change the rhetoric. We need to stand up against hate when we see it. And we need to remind everybody that America has been built by immigrants on the backs of certain immigrants. Immigrants have been providing so much value and benefits to this country for centuries. That hasn't changed, and that's not going to change. And if we don't start to change that rhetoric, if that doesn't become the predominant message and narrative coming out, and I don't think it is right now. I think this kind of like wall building, Muslim banning rhetoric is really winning out. If we don't start to get our narrative out there and in all of the communities and circles that we work with, then all of this work around L students and all these other pieces are just going to be that much harder.
I'm tempted to say what Steve said, but I'll encourage you to take a look at if there's a website. There's a project that we're involved with Big Picture Learning called the Deeper Learning Equity Fellows, and the website is equityfellows.org. For those of you who are familiar with the U Health Foundation's push around deeper learning, we've been part of that work, this project, this fellowship, really grew out of lots of conversations about where's the equity in that conversation around deeper learning. And for us, very specifically, it came around when we talk about deeper learning for all students, are we really again talking about all students? And so this fellowship is really designed to bring together educators from across the spectrum that work with lots of different groups of students. And really as broad a diverse a group of people as possible that are working on individualized projects that are embedded in the sphere of work that they're involved in, to really further the cause of both deeper learning and equity and make sure that those things are linked more strongly. We're in the final stages of selecting our second cohort for that project, but there's some information on that website, and there will be a cohort 3 as well.
I can say the same as they said. I think the two things, what's not knowing kind of how the three of us would kind of bring things together, I think the notion of really thinking through what does asset-based teaching and learning look like, as well as coalition building from that perspective. What does it look like? Of course, I'm going to direct you to our tsol.org website, because we have resources for teachers, practicing teachers, as well as those who are in the business of teacher preparation, because that's another huge element in terms of making the learning environments in the schools for this group of students different and really changing them into more equitable environments. We have a big task ahead of us.
Since we're here, I would like to, mention the AFT's resource, which is a website called colorincolorado.org. So it's www.colorincolorado.org, which is a collaboration between the AFT, our local PBS station, WETA, and we have other collaborators like the NEA, the U.S. Department of Education, and basically it has, it's a comprehensive clearinghouse of what works for English language learners, for educators, and for families. And then I also want to direct our audience and viewers later on to articles in American Educator, which are online. One article from the summer 2013 issue, I believe, and then summer 2008 before that. But they're pretty comprehensive syntheses on what the research says works for English language learners, and what high quality means, and the research questions that are yet to be answered, because we still don't know a lot. But those articles were both by Claude Goldenberg from Stanford, and so those articles are online. So with that, I would like to close and really thank our just amazing, wonderful panelists for everything that you have taught us today, for everything that you do in your everyday work. Please, continue, to carry this torch for our kids and this population. And thank you very much to our audience here and our viewers later on. Thank you.